Hello everyone, welcome to Psych. And last week I asked you all to leave me some questions relating to MBTI, personality psychology, in my community tab. So today I'm going to be answering some of the questions that were left for me in that little questionnaire, and I'm going to be giving a shout out to the people who left those questions. Let's get into it. So forgive me if I get any names wrong here. I'm going to be doing my best to read these names off of the YouTube app here. So the first question comes from Keaner. How does mental illness affect type, if at all? For example, depression, anxiety, antisocial bipolar, schizophrenia, addiction, eating disorders. So I have a video talking about personality disorders and personality type and how they kind of influence each other, and you can check that out. That came out on Halloween of last year. But I can briefly go over some of the important topics and points when it comes to personality disorders and mental illness. So it's important to remember that if you have a mental illness or a disorder of some kind, it's going to influence what you're likely to test as on a personality type, because it's likely going to spike your scores in certain areas. Say, for example, you have somebody who has schizoid personality disorder, which is characterized by a very high level of introversion. But that person is not naturally an introverted type of person. They have a disorder which causes them to be introverted. That's when it becomes more of a disorder instead of a personality trait related to their type. So, for example, if you had somebody who scored in the 99th percentile of introversion, this is somebody who's very introverted, they like to be home almost all the time, they can go weeks without interacting with people and they're fine with this. If this is not a problem for them, if it's not causing a disruption to their life or what they want to get out of life, then it's not something that is typically seen as a disorder and more so just a personality trait. But if you have somebody who has this kind of problem or disorder, they're staying in their house all the time for some sort of reason, they're highly introverted, and it's kind of neurotic to them, it's disrupting them from accomplishing what they want in life, that's when it becomes more of a personality disorder or mental illness. So mental illnesses and disorders can spike certain scores, but it doesn't always mean that certain types are likely to have certain disorders. We do tend to see that there are correlations between type and disorders. For example, ENFPs and INFPs are likely to have bipolar personality disorder compared to other disorders, whereas introverted types, again, are likely to have certain disorders like schizoid or schizotypal compared to the extroverted types. But this also, again, goes back to the idea that it could be just those disorders spiking those scores and causing the testing to be incorrect. So this question is more so about me than it is type overall, but Rumple Stiltskin asks, what is something that made your ENFJ wife fall in love with you? So I didn't feel comfortable answering this question myself because I felt like it would have been kind of egotistical to say, these are my good traits. So I asked her if she would be willing to answer this question for me, and this is what she responded. I initially fell in love with you when you showed me that you could talk me down when I was hysterical or upset. You knew how to make me feel safe and comfortable. You were always patient with me. And secondly, I love your mind. So those are the traits that she says she appreciates. When I've asked her about these types of things in the past, it's usually something along the lines of patience. I don't have a temper. I'm not somebody who really has a temper. I don't get angry very often. So I guess that's what she appreciates. Now, the second part to this question was how to be more so emotionally expressive as an INTJ, because the person who asked says they are in a relationship with an INFJ. Now, being an INTJ with an NFJ partner is difficult, and there are certainly going to be some road bumps. I've been with my wife now for more than 4 years, which isn't very long if you think about things in terms of the long term, but it is, a decent amount for someone who's my age. And my biggest piece of advice is just that you don't have to be emotionally expressive, but giving FE types affirmation, like words of affirmation and confirmation that you appreciate them emotionally, is something that they really enjoy. Just like a good morning text here or there, maybe go to Starbucks and buy them coffee when they're at work or something, the occasional gift. Small little signs like that can go a long way when you are with an extroverted feeling type. On to the next one. So this one's from Y2K Media, and they ask, Carl Jung mentioned in his book Psychological Types that if it wasn't for introverted intuition, there would never be any prophets in Israel. What thoughts do you have in regards to NI being linked to prophecy or divine revelation? So Jung does kind of talk about the idea of introverted intuition being related to some sort of kind of prophetic trait, especially at one point he refers to them with kind of this relation to the Cassandra complex, Cassandra being the historical prophet who was cursed to have visions of what could be but could not explain them accurately or well enough to her peers to make her be believable. And this is the issue that the introverted intuitive faces in Carl Jung's mind, is that they often have great vision and insight into what is likely to happen because they look at underlying themes and how they unfold over time, and they're kind of able to predict things with a decent level of accuracy. But if they don't develop their auxiliary judging function, then they have no way of meaningfully communicating this to other people. So, for example, introverted intuition is an irrational subjective function, which means it's the most personal and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to someone else. So converting that to an objective rational function, such as extroverted thinking or extroverted feeling, is extremely important for the introverted perceiving dominant types, especially the introverted intuitives who tend to be future focused and like to focus on things related to prediction or how things are going to unfold over time. So yes, I do think there is not, I don't want to call it prophetic, because I don't think introverted intuitives are prophets by any means, but they do like to look at how things unfold over time, and that can give them certain traits that people would consider prophetic. Back to the Roots asks, can you talk some more about having a stronger third than second function? You mentioned it could just be a developmental phase rather than truly jumping. So it's important to remember that when you're talking about the Myers-Briggs model, that just because your functions are in a 1, 2, 3, 4 order doesn't mean they're inherently strong or used in that order. The biggest differentiator when it comes to the function stack is going to be the first and fourth function, because they have the largest part in the psyche. Your fourth function plays a much larger part in the psyche than your auxiliary or tertiary function, because it's directly oppositional to your dominant function, which is a huge majority of the personality as well. Now, the auxiliary and tertiary functions exist in a state of relative balance, and they're almost even in terms of how they influence the psyche. Now, what's interesting about the tertiary function is that it actually exists in the dominant attitude. So, for example, if you're an introverted type, then your tertiary function is also going to be introverted. And what this usually means is that the tertiary function is something that is highly valued in the psyche, but it's something that's not going to be terribly beneficial to the individual in the same way that the auxiliary function might be, because it doesn't balance you out the same way the auxiliary function does. So the auxiliary function is oppositional but not antagonistic to the dominant function, and acts as a way of presenting it. Kind of like how I mentioned earlier with the Cassandra complex and their need to turn the subjective into the objective. But the tertiary function is something that's going to be very important to the individual, and I would describe it almost as an inner desire. And you might find that, yes, certain people will get attached onto this kind of inner desire part of their life, and that might influence how they're going to develop, and they might even have a temporary, what some would call a jumper phase if you look at typing systems like objective personality. But in my opinion, this would be more so a developmental phase than something permanent, because the conscious attitude is something that needs to be developed and balanced alongside the unconscious attitude, and I don't think it's inherently healthy to be, for example, an NI-FI INTJ. For example, this is why we say that INTJs can get stuck in loops, which is an NI-FI loop. I would say that somebody who's stuck in that type of thinking for too long is somebody who needs to balance their psyche out with something of the opposite attitude, like the auxiliary function. All right, so Yuki Buzzybee asks, do you read any fiction? If so, could you mention some of your favorite books and why you like them? So my favorite books are the Night Angel trilogy by Brent Weeks. It's an adult fantasy type of book. It follows a young man who is essentially like a magical assassin, and it's all about his growth and journey as an individual and his moral development. And to me, it was just a really interesting fantasy series. I like fantasy that delves into more adult topics and isn't afraid to explore those types of things. So I would only recommend it if you're comfortable with those types of things, but I really enjoy the Night Angel trilogy, and I would recommend that. Blaze Warrior asks, is Holland Code reliable to test my aptitude? Can thinking judges have artistic Holland Code? So Holland Code, also known as RIASEC, is a common career appraisal tool, and it's actually one that I use in my career coaching sometimes. And I would say it is fairly reliable if you're looking to see what types of interests somebody is going to have. Now, this is separate from personality type, because your interests as an individual can go against your types. For example, yes, you could have an ENTJ with an artistic bend to them. They might be focusing their efforts on something in the realms of arts. I knew a person who was a very artistic, extroverted thinking dominant person, and they majored in art and management. So they kind of mixed their two fields of interests with their natural cognition. And to me, that was really interesting. So yes, I think RIASEC does have some uses, and you can be of some interests that are against your natural personality type's normal interests. So PureX asks, what are your thoughts on Voltology and Sandoval's cognitive type theory? So I don't know much about Sandoval's theory personally, but I can tell you my opinions on Voltology. And people who don't know what voltology is, it's the reading of personality type via facial expressions, hand movements, anything of that nature, kind of movement in general from a person and how that relates to their cognition. Now, in my opinion, I don't think voltology is the best way to determine someone's personality type because there's a lot of things that can influence how someone presents their eye, hand, head, body movements in general, such as cultural norms. And it's hard to read certain people if they're going to have body movements that you're not typically used to, or you might even find, in my opinion, that you're going to find people who have these types of body movements who don't match their type overall. Like when I type people, I've met plenty of people, for example, who don't use the voltological symbols that match the personality type that I would end up typing them as. And it's because I don't think these things are defining of a personality type. They are more so a supporting factor that can be used to kind of be evidence for typing someone as a certain type, but they're not defining enough for me to want to type someone solely off of that. For example, you might find when you're typing EP personality types that they do a lot of this. They'll look up and around and they'll move their hands and they're very energetic with their movements. That's common with EPs, for example, but that doesn't mean that every EP that I've ever come across does this when they're talking, or they're very high and energetic in their movements. It's really going to depend on the individual, how they've been raised, what their cultural norms are, and things of that nature. So I would say that voltology overall is something that isn't something that you should just throw out the window, but it's not defining enough to be used as a defining typing system for me. Luv Sakura asks, speaking of Jung's cognitive functions, is it safe to say there is no such thing as an ambivert? Rather, these people had just improved, cultivated their other intro-extroverted functions that makes them extro-introverted, even though their basic stacks aren't. So the idea of the ambivert is kind of hard to talk about because people who look at MBTI want to think of things in one or the other. You're either introverted or you're either extroverted. But all that introversion and extroversion defines in the terms of Jung's cognitive functions is what your primary focus is. Now, some people can be far more introverted than other people, and some people can be far more extroverted than other people. But Jung himself says there's no such thing as a pure introvert or extrovert. Such a person would be in a lunatic asylum, and I would agree with that. Those are often people who are highly neurotic or in bad states, which is why I say, for example, it's not a good idea to be like an NIFI INTJ or an NITI INFJ, because if you fall too far into the realm of one or two cognitive functions into one attitude of the psyche, then you're not going to gain the benefits of the other side of the psyche. I do think that most people, like 75 to 90% of people, are relatively ambiverted. They're able to be, right, they have a preference for introversion or extroversion, but they're able to interact with that other side of the psyche without too much conflict. So I do think that ambiverts are actually the norm, and pure introverts and extroverts rarely exist in a healthy manner. All right, this is going to be the last question for this video. So AMO asks, as an INTJ, what is your ambition, such as being a well-known scientist or something else? So my future goals right now involve getting into either a master's or a PhD program and eventually becoming a clinical psychologist. I'm exclusively interested in becoming a clinical psychologist, and I'm not really considering any other alternatives at this moment. Now, I want to be a clinical psychologist because I'm interested in both research and working with individuals one-on-one. To me, there's beauty in kind of reaching a hand out to somebody who's at their lowest point in life and helping them up. And just being at that low point is something that I think that there's an inherent beauty in as well. As Carl Jung says in one of his books, but this is a quote that's well known, for a tree to reach to heaven, its roots must reach down to hell. And I think that this is absolutely true, and that people who are at that lowest point in their life can really reach great heights if they are able to get out of that dark period and get their life going in the opposite direction. And I believe that those are usually the people who often have a great appreciation for the little things in life, and they're able to really help others because they've been in a dark place themselves. So that's kind of why I want to be a clinical psychologist, and I want to do research related to more severe mental illnesses. I guess you could say I kind of want to be known one day. I'd like to leave my mark on the field of psychology. It would be nice to kind of maybe have my name in a textbook one day or be known for something, but I wouldn't say that's a top priority. All right, everybody, I hope you've enjoyed this kind of Q&A type discussion. I would like to remind everybody that I do have personality typing sessions available on my website, asurapsych.com, if you're interested in working with me to find out what your personality type is and what that means for you. This has been Asura at Asura Psych. Have a good one.